into my office. The purpose of today's economic briefing is to update you on New Zealand's economic outlook and the lead up to next month's budget. I've got a short presentation today. It's about 10 minutes long, and then afterwards I'll obviously invite your questions. The reason for the update is that it's a long time since the Treasury published its last set of forecasts in the December half-year update, and a lot has changed since then. And before I begin, I do need to say that I have a hard finish at 1 p.m. today. I am getting on a plane shortly to attend the annual Australia-New Zealand Finance Ministers meeting in Brisbane. As you know, I spent most of the last week in Washington, DC, where I got the opportunity to hear firsthand from many of my international counterparts about how they are responding to the conflict in the Middle East. They, like us, are working overtime, both to respond to the crisis and to understand its impact on their economies. Today, I am going to detail the scenarios Treasury developed just under a month ago to explore the potential impact on New Zealand of further oil market instability. But before I do so, let me give you some context, which somewhat explains how difficult it is to provide forecasts in the current environment and the range of scenarios that are possible. Last week, the International Monetary Fund released its latest World Economic Outlook. In contrast to previous times, their outlook contained a reference forecast as well as two alternative downside scenarios, reflecting very high levels of uncertainty. The scenarios are graphed. The scenarios are graphed on the table shown on the screen. Yeah, that's the right one. With the reference forecast projecting global growth falling from 3.3 to 3.1% this year, but remaining unchanged next year at 3.2%, whereas under the adverse scenario, larger and more persistent increases in energy prices would slow global growth to 2.5% in 2026, and inflation would reach 5.4% this year. They also present a severe scenario, which you can see in there, which has greater damage to energy infrastructure in the Middle East, and there you would see global growth reducing to about 2% in 2026, with headline inflation reaching just above 6% by 2027. The IMF says this would mean a close call for a global recession, which it defines as a growth rate below 2%. That has only happened 4 times since 1980. The last 2 occasions corresponded with the global financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. So the point that I'm trying to make with you is that in these circumstances, it is not surprising that economists everywhere are heavily caveating their forecasts. However, the IMF's advice about how countries should respond to the oil shock is clear. Countries should preserve price and financial stability, safeguard fiscal sustainability, and implement structural reforms without further delay. When fiscal support is deemed necessary to protect the most vulnerable, it should be, quote, targeted, timely, temporary, and funded within current budget envelopes by reprioritising spending. That is exactly what this government is doing and what we will stick to in our upcoming budget. The extra $50 a week going to low to middle income working families with kids is being delivered out of the funding already allocated for this year's budget, for which we have set an operating allowance ceiling of $2.4 billion. This next, so there's your quote. The next slide shows how the world is starting. The next slide shows how the world is starting to adjust to the disruption to shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. It comes from the international energy watchdog, the International Energy Agency. What's interesting about the slide is it shows the flow of crude oil from the Middle East. As you can see, prior to the conflict, exports were averaging about 24 million barrels a day, and the vast majority of that oil transited through the Strait of Hormuz. In the immediate aftermath of the conflict, exports from the Middle East declined significantly. But what you can see from the dark blue bars on the graph is that increasing amounts of oil are now finding their way out of the Gulf via other means, which is to say that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz does not mean that all of the oil that once passed through that strait is trapped. Increasing amounts of it are getting out of the Middle East by other means. As of 2 weeks ago, volumes were averaging more than 10 million barrels a day. And of course, that's off a base of 24 million barrels a day. It's less than pre-conflict, but it's not an insignificant amount of crude oil that is still getting out of the Middle East. And this very much accords with what I heard from my Singaporean and Malaysian counterparts at the IMF and World Bank meetings in Washington. At this point in time, they tell me that obtaining supplies of crude oil is not an issue. Price is obviously another matter. So let me turn now to the scenarios that Treasury developed late last month. They followed an earlier set of less severe scenarios produced in early March, which I shared with you at the time. They developed the scenarios that I'm about to outline following the price of oil going higher than they had used in the scenarios I previously produced for you. It's important to note that these scenarios are about what might happen. They're not forecasts of what Treasury think will happen. Treasury developed 3 scenarios, and to estimate how the conflict will affect economic activity, Treasury must estimate how much global oil supply could fall and for how long, and then how oil prices will respond. That is a lot of things to be forecasting. The main variable, of course, being how long and how severe the disruption to oil moving through the Strait of Hormuz is. So I'm going to take you to the scenarios. So you can see them on the screen. There's a best case scenario, a best case scenario, a prolonged conflict scenario, and a prolonged and more severe conflict scenario. So those are 1, 2, and 3. If you look at the base scenario in that diagram, the base that we're referring to there is the mid-March forecasts which Treasury had, which was a period free from the conflict, and then the scenarios 1, 2, and 3 are how they've adapted their forecasts in light of the escalating conflict in the Middle East. So that best case scenario, scenario 1, is for a short conflict with oil prices averaging US $110 a barrel in the second quarter of this year before returning to pre-conflict levels early next year. So for context, as we meet today, Brent crude oil is sitting at US $102 a barrel. So in that scenario 1, you have oil prices averaging US $110 a barrel in the second quarter of this year, the quarter that we are in right now. The second scenario, which is for a prolonged conflict, has oil prices averaging higher at US $135 a barrel for the second and third quarters of this year before falling back to pre-conflict levels in early 2028. And the third scenario, the worst case, if you like, although Treasury don't say that's the worst case because there's always worse things that can happen, but in that worst case on that list of scenarios, that's for a prolonged and more severe conflict in which oil prices would reach US $180 a barrel on average in the second and third quarters of this year. So again, for context, the price of oil right now is sitting at US $102 a barrel. In that third scenario, oil prices would gradually fall, but with prices remaining elevated until early 2030. So these scenarios were produced a month ago, and if a week is a long time in politics, a day is a long time in the oil markets. Since the scenarios were produced, prices have continued to move around, both for the price of crude oil today and the futures price of oil. But they haven't got anywhere near US $180 a barrel at any point. So the price of oil right now is a little over half the level Treasury had in the third scenario, but you can see that at this point, of the 3 scenarios Treasury developed last month, the first one, scenario 1, looks the most likely. If that does remain the case, it means we face some significant short-term challenges and heightened medium to long-term risks. You can see in that scenario 1 that Treasury has inflation reaching 3.9%. It has growth falling back to 2%. It has the unemployment rate at 5.3%. But again, I stress, these are not Treasury's forecasts. This is a scenario. The Treasury has presented me with some forecasts. However, this week they have decided to reopen the forecasts for this year's budget. That is an independent decision of the Treasury to do so, and I have not yet been briefed on what those final forecasts will be, but they will be what informs the budget that I present to you in May. The Cabinet will take our final fiscal decisions at our Cabinet meeting in the next few weeks, and then that will be combined with the Treasury's final economic forecasts and will inform the budget documents that we present to you. I did see updated forecasts from the Treasury on the 1st of April, but as we are in a moving feast, as I say, they have decided to reopen them. So it is true to say to you today that I cannot confirm for you what their final forecasts look like. I think what it does show you is that while we face significant short-term challenges and heightened medium to long-term risks, we also hold out the hope that oil will gradually resume flowing through the Strait of Hormuz in the second half of this year. We obviously can't take that for granted. There is still a huge amount of uncertainty about the ceasefire, and in the last few days the price of Brent crude has bounced up and down as different developments in the Middle East have been reported. But events of the past few weeks, conversations with trading partners and the latest futures pricing for oil provide some cause for optimism, albeit with ongoing volatility. I'm going to show you that graph now, because what that shows you is the pale blue line is what is actually happening with the oil price. And you can see that that is looking at what the futures market is saying about how much a barrel of oil will be in those future periods. And that pale blue line reflecting the best data we have today is obviously a better scenario than we're seeing in Treasury Scenario 2 and Scenario 3. The Treasury's advice to me is essentially this, that the markets are expecting oil to dip back below US $80 a barrel about the end of the year, and that is based on what futures markets are saying. And on that basis, Treasury's advice to me is that New Zealand's economic recovery is delayed but not derailed. Bank economists also expect the economy to keep growing in 2026. And so what we are presenting to you is a picture of an economy that has been disrupted but not derailed and will continue to grow this year. Finally, let me acknowledge the Moody's decision overnight to put New Zealand's AAA credit rating on negative watch. It is important to bear in mind that we are still one of only 11 countries in the world to have Moody's highest rating. But the revision to have us on watch is confirmation, if confirmation was still needed, that the government's response to the fuel crisis and its wider approach to the economy is the right one. I am very conscious that many New Zealanders would like to see us splashing the cash right now, and I would love to ease the pressure that many people are feeling. We simply can't do that responsibly as a country right now, because we cannot just keep spending more and borrowing more, as some have suggested. If we do that, this credit rating agency is confirming, is that we would risk higher interest rates, higher borrowing costs, which would put more pressure on Kiwi families and would weaken our economy into the future. So in the interest of time, I'll stop there and take questions. I realise I've presented some quite complicated information. I'm happy to take all of your questions.
In your mind, are we out of the woods in that worst case scenario of 7.4% inflation?
It seems highly unlikely that the price of oil would be almost doubling to US $180 this year. And that's what that scenario is based on. Based on the information I've gathered from trading partners, from global economic experts, but also what the futures market is telling us, that seems extremely unlikely.
We're a month away from...
But, you know, at the beginning of the year, if you'd said to me it's extremely, we're going to have a massive conflict in the Middle East and New Zealanders are going to see the price of diesel double at the pump, I would have said that was pretty unlikely too.
So we're a month away from the budget. How much of a rewrite is the situation and also the delayed economic recovery having on that? Are you having to completely look at everything?
It's always the case that budgets are iterative, and I fully expected even before this crisis that I would still be nailing the details of the budget at this point. But it is the case that we're having to squeeze additional things into the budget that we hadn't envisaged. That's things like the support package for low-income working families, which we are having to fund out of this year's budget, It's things like the support for home and care workers and a number of other contingencies we're putting in place for pressures that we can expect in public services as a result of the higher fuel price. So that has meant a rework. And just like every Kiwi household in the country right now who's looking at their higher costs for petrol or diesel and having to rejig things elsewhere, we're having to rejig things a bit elsewhere.
Minister, unemployment stands out to me there because if that remains really high, it's a huge pressure on the government's books to pay for people to be on the benefit. Have you taken that into account and how much the government will potentially have to borrow to keep supporting that high unemployment?
Well, I'd just first say that what you see in that scenario 1, which, as I've said to you at this point, is most akin to what's happening, although possibly even a little more pessimistic than what we're seeing in the here and now, that has unemployment falling into the future. So essentially, in that scenario, we think the worst quarter that we'll be in for growth is the second quarter that we're in right now, and we would expect to see unemployment recovering in the future. It is always the case that in their economic forecasts, the Treasury account for the costs of their estimates on unemployment and employment levels. And one of the wonderful things about a growing economy is we expect more people to be in work, fewer people to be on benefits, and therefore the costs to the Crown to be lower.
So how much of a wake-up call is that Moody's credit rating, and how much interest are we actually paying each year on that?
Yeah, look, it should be a wake-up call to any politician in this place who says the answer to New Zealand's problems is just to spend more. It's not. That is a very, very irresponsible answer, because what the ratings authorities are telling us is if you don't sort your books out, New Zealand, we're not going to be able to say that you're a good credit risk in the way that we have previously. And it's just like anyone else. If you get a bad credit rating, it gets very much harder to borrow in the future. And so as an economy, we have a responsibility, I think, not just to the needs that many New Zealanders have in the here and now, but also to think about the position we're putting ourselves in for the future. And I have felt very reinforced in our government's objectives, which are to get the books back in balance so that we can stop borrowing more and so that we can bend that debt curve down. And the Moody's report confirms that that is the right thing to be doing. In terms of the borrowing costs right now, our borrowing costs are around $9.2 billion a year in interest alone. $9.2 billion is such a big number, it's hard for people to conceive of. So the way I often explain it is that it's more funding than you would have for the entire Defence Force, the entire Corrections Service, the entire Courts Service, and the entire Police and Customs Services combined, a year's operation. So $9.2 billion is a huge amount of money. And if we keep borrowing more, that interest bill just goes up, up, up.
Put another way.
How have some of the government's decisions contributed to that rating, though? For example, looking at the 2024 tax cuts.
Well, our government has made $43 billion worth of savings across 2 budgets because we have been committed to getting New Zealand's spending levels under control. We've set a really clear target of getting spending back to around 30% of the economy where it's at historically. The last Labor government left us with an out-of-control fiscal situation. And every time we have made a hard choice to deliver savings, whether that was our changes to the pay equity regime, reductions in the back office of the public service, changes to the way benefits are adjusted, our opponents have told us that is the wrong thing to do and we should be spending more. So to me, the choice is really clear. Do you want fiscal discipline in a government that cares about your future and your kids' future? Or do you want politicians who want to pull the wool over your eyes and tell you that the answer is just spending more? They don't know where to find the money.
Do you interpret the Moody's as saying either you need to stick to the track that you promised, or they're saying really you should be doing a bit more?
No, I interpret it as very much you need to stick to the track you promised. In that report, what they suggest is that they see a 1 in 3 risk that things get worse than what we've previously forecast, and that's the risk that they are looking at. They agree with our fiscal goals and objectives. They agree with the objective we set of when to return to surplus, doing that in a gradual way, ensuring that's a responsible consolidation. They agree with our debt reduction goals. They think all of those things are positive. What they're really just saying, in my mind, stick to the course.
So there's been surplus slippage since 2021.
Yeah, as has
So
been
they
well
basically
known
say
to
it's
New
gotta-
Zealanders,
it's gotta not happen
yeah,
anymore.
our economic recovery has been harder than had been forecast a few years ago, and the impact of that has been not only to New Zealanders and their jobs and livelihoods, but also to the government books. And so what Moody's is saying is it's really important you stick to those goals of getting the books in balance and bending the debt curve down, because over the past few years you've struggled to do that, and we worry that, I think that what they worry is that future politicians will take their eye off those really important targets.
But right now we're borrowing. Right now we're.
In terms of Treasury scenarios 2 and 3, what is the oil outlook past Q3? Does it drop back to normal, or does it continue to be high?
So in scenario 2, the oil price averages US $135 per barrel in Q2 and Q3 2026, then gradually falls back to the pre-shock level in early 2028.
Was the $44 billion
also-
of savings that you just mentioned actually savings, or were you just redirecting $44 billion from one place to another?
Those were savings that, in the absence of which, we wouldn't have had the funding to invest in health, education areas that every year we have to invest more in. Why do we have to invest more in them? Because some people say to me, just don't increase the funding for health or education. Well, in health, we have not only a growing population, we have an ageing population, and the costs of our health system continue to increase. Well, instead of it is not a saving in the sense that we are spending less as a government. It is a saving in the sense that in the absence of making those savings, we would not have been able to fund increases to health and education and essential services without borrowing more. And so making those savings has minimised the borrowing. In the absence of those savings, we would be spending $43 billion more than we are in the budget documents.
In that same vein then, we're still borrowing to keep the lights on, right? So are you willing to take any drastic action that would actually save the government money? Have you looked at superannuation and the ballooning cost of that? And would you look at, say, means testing it or raising the age in a more in a more drastic fashion than the long-term goal of the National Party to do so?
Well, the first best thing I can do is resist the calls, which I am very sympathetic to, from a lot of people right now who are asking me to splash the cash. And, the example I'd give you, One News last night ran a poll in which they said, New Zealanders, would you like the government to be cutting the petrol price even if it meant adding to borrowing? And I think that poll showed a majority of New Zealanders said yes. I understand that. People are hurting. But at the same time, as a government, we've taken this course of resisting that because we know that would come with so much more borrowing, it would endanger our economy. So that's the first best thing we can do, is stick to the course that we're on, ensuring we do provide temporary and targeted support, and we do target the areas that are necessary and essential, but resisting the calls from many quarters to spend a lot of cash. Then the second thing that we need to do is stick to the really hard targets we've set ourselves as a government. When you look at the incremental new money I've allowed ourselves in each budget, it is drastically lower than Grant Robertson ever did. When you look at the track record of me sticking to those operating allowances I set, I've never spent more than I said I would in an operating allowance. In fact, in each budget so far, I've spent less. That is in stark contrast to the last government, who always spent more in the operating allowance than they committed. So sticking to those things is possible. You're right. It will require ongoing discipline and reforms. We will have to keep looking for new savings in every budget.
I guess the counter argument to you sticking to your budget allowances is that a lot of people might think that you shouldn't have a budget allowance and find new spending within baselines.
You're perfectly articulating the line I have to walk, which is you're right. There are some people who would say, stop putting more money into our hospitals. Well, I have to look the New Zealanders in the eye who are waiting for hip operations, who need cancer treatment, and tell them there's not more money for the hospitals.
But
I'm
we
not
do the
prepared
public
to do
service
that. No, we do not. As a proportion of the public service, the back office has shrunk significantly by many metrics. But we do have, it is true, more nurses in our hospitals. We do have more corrections officers, making sure that our prisons can keep us safe from violent offenders. We have more frontline roles in the public service, delivering things I think most New Zealanders would agree are a priority. We've reduced administrative roles, policy analyst roles, manager roles. We've asked the public service to do more with less.
In the last budget, you decided to means test the Best Start payment.
Yes.
Why would you do that to young families and not superannuitants?
Well, on the Best Start payment, the choice we made was to align it with what had always been the case in the second and third year of the payment, which was that it is targeted at lower income families, not universally provided to high income families. The Cabinet took that decision on its own merits. As I've said, in future budgets we'll take other decisions on their own merits.
Just on the Strait of Hormuz modelling that you showed before, I noticed on the debate hill there was quite a big spike in the amount of oil going.
This one?
Yes, that one. There's quite a big spike bypassing the strait altogether. Are you hopeful that, you talked a little bit about markets adapting, are you hopeful that in the future we might see just a trend that more oil is just going to bypass the strait?
Well, there's two things happening. So this slide focuses on the Strait, but of course the other thing that's happening is that we are seeing crude oil coming out of West Africa, the US, frankly Russia, other parts of the world, and wherever possible oil producers are increasing their supply so that they can sell that in a world that's clearly demanding oil, and that's happening in real time, and we'll continue to see that crank up because when prices are as high as they are, more people want to be in the business of selling oil. On the first bit of your question about what we're seeing in the Strait of Hormuz, I am hopeful that even as the Strait of Hormuz opens, that we might, of course that would be a complete reopening, but what I think is more likely is that would be a gradual reopening. We might see more going out that way, but in the meantime we might see more going out through the pipes into the Red Sea, more going overland, more finding other ways out of that region of the world. Okay, who am I going to go with? Yes, I'm going to go with you, Julia.
You have previously not wanted to share scenarios like you just had on the previous slide. What's changed?
I always was going to share them. I just wanted to do it fully in the way that I have today because, as you can appreciate, there is so much context here, and I just knew that there would be mischief. People would say 7.4% inflation, and I just wanted to take you through and show you that would require oil being at $180 a barrel for a long time, and that is not looking very realistic. And so I think it's important you have context for these scenarios. I want to be open and transparent about it, that yes, if oil went really high, inflation could get really bad here, but I do want to give you a sense of how it is that we're making these choices and calibrating them. Yes.
What's your response to Labor agreeing to back the FTA?
Thank goodness, took their time, didn't they? It almost took them more time to agree to it than it took for us to negotiate it.
Can I just ask on those scenarios? That book's about a month old. Where do you go from here with that severe scenario, 7.4, about $4.50 a pump? Do you think that has gotten better or worse?
Sorry, do I think which scenarios got better or worse?
The last one. I mean, do you think the conditions have improved in the last month that would have changed those scenarios?
Look, as I said, we'll present the forecasts at the budget, and what we've been tracking in particular is the futures price for oil, and also the way that oil price is transmitting through the global economy. Yes.
On the press release you put out this morning about Chanel investing in a farm in Otago.
Yeah.
What's so great about that, and why is it happening?
Well, I'm such a huge champion for our wool industry. We should be so proud of that organic, safe, natural fibre that we produce. And when you see a global brand like Chanel, that clearly is a premium brand, saying actually the best wool in the world that we want to associate ourselves with is New Zealand wool, that's positive for the entire wool industry, not just the people living on that farm and working for that farm, but it shines a light on our great product. And I'd love to see that product getting higher prices into the future.
Add is going to be in New Zealand or in France?
The value add will be absolutely here in the sense that that is the only reason that investment is proceeding, is that it will support more jobs and incomes for New Zealanders. Luke?
You talked about the Treasury reopening their forecasts. When are they expecting to close those? And related to that, when are you actually expecting to close the book on the budget this year?
Yeah, so they reopened the forecasts this week and then they've closed them again. They just haven't presented them to me yet. So they are now, those are the economic forecasts which they've finalised. Obviously the fiscal forecasts, what we are spending, We won't finalise till Cabinet takes its decisions. I haven't in the past revealed which Cabinet meeting we decide the budget at, but I can be open. It's in the next couple of weeks.
Just on that, Minister, how unusual is it for the Treasury to reopen its forecasts like that? And the second part to that question, you described the job as a rejig. Can you just provide a bit of scope as to how big that job is?
Look, it is unusual. It's very unusual for them to reopen their forecasts, and I think it just reflects the volatility of the global situation. And Treasury are working their hardest to make those forecasts as accurate as they can be, but they are just very cognizant that every time these numbers move in international markets, it has pretty significant implications for what they're forecasting in growth, inflation, the state of our books. In terms of the rejig, this is a discipline that we as a government have been in now since we came into office, which is that we are constantly in the process of saying, unless we make more savings here, we are not going to be able to make the investments we need to here. We set out very clearly in our fiscal strategy that it will always be a priority for us to deliver funding for health services for New Zealanders, to educate our kids better, for law and order. We are also rebuilding the capability of our Defence Force, investing significantly in infrastructure. To achieve those things, we always need to be reprioritising on the other side of the ledger and finding savings. And so in this budget, we've had to once again double down on that.
But just how big that
equity earlier. Is there any big ticket savings that you've found for this budget?
There's a range of savings that we've found, which we'll present at the budget. There's a range.
Minister, just quickly on fuel supply, how can we guarantee future refined fuel supply from South Korea? And what's the plan if they start to ban exports and protect their own economy?
So first of all, the South Koreans have been very clear with us that they are not planning export restrictions. So we take them at their word, and that is a message that has been affirmed by many of our partner countries. It also reflects the commercial realities for South Korea, which is they know that at the point they introduced export controls, that would actually do lasting damage to their reputation as a place to do business with. In terms of future orders, fuel importing companies are telling us that their orders are secure through the end of May and that they're not having challenges placing future orders into June. We also, of course, are looking upstream to say, okay, well, that's what the refineries are saying. Is that based on good information? And what we can see, as I said, is that there are new sources of crude oil flowing into those refineries. They're actually finding it elsewhere where they haven't been able to get it out of the Middle East. They're getting it out of Brazil. They're getting it out of Africa. They're getting it out of other places. And in confirmation of that, Starboard Intelligence, who are ship trackers, have provided us with some analysis in which they say actually the amount of crude oil that seems to be going into those South Korean and Singaporean refineries right now looks very similar to what it averaged over the past year, which again is just another confirmation point. We're looking for lots of different confirmation points. We'll keep doing that. We're not just looking for good news. We're constantly looking for, are there any data points here that should give us pause, that should make us consider moving to that second phase in the fuel plan? Yeah.
Do you have any idea of the uptake of that yet?
I don't have that data to hand, but I'm very happy to follow that up with you later. But I do know, based on the briefing I read, which I can't recall the numbers from right now, but the briefing I read said that there's been really strong interest, huge numbers of phone calls into the IRD, people saying that it would really make a difference and that we're very keen to ensure they got it.
How would you characterise the attitude of the US administration and the briefings that you would have had with them last week in Washington about the problems that this is creating both for New Zealand and many other countries? Do they care, or are we on our own?
I had two different official engagements. In one of them, which was with a Treasury secretary, an official, as opposed to a politically appointed person. Actually, at one point, he did say, look, I recognise that it's creating a lot of impact for your economy. Are there ways in which we could assist? And you can imagine I was pretty clear, which was yes, a enduring ceasefire and peace in the Middle East would assist. In my second briefing, a difficult message for me to hear was that the US does view that it is largely going to be resilient to the economic effects of this conflict. It recognises that other countries won't be that lucky, but is of the view that it will be okay. And the point that I emphasised was just to say, okay, I recognise that this might be okay for the US economy, but it's doing a lot of harm to economies like mine, and I urge you, in the interests of a world in which we have shared global prosperity, that you consider that.
Minister, the worst case scenario that's been painted out of unemployment reaching 6.6% next year is likely to concern some of our readers, especially those who may be unemployed at the moment, perhaps had a long search for work already. They will know that there's still a worst
But
case
before you
scenario.
tell your readers that number, what you're going to say to them is that that's based on US $180 a barrel of oil, which is almost twice what the oil price is today, and that being sustained through this year and next. So I think that's a bit like saying to your readers, unemployment could go this high if there was an outbreak of foot and mouth. It's not looking likely right now, and I just think it's very important that we do give that context to New Zealanders right now, and that we don't present worse scenarios than are likely. I'm presenting these to be good faith, but I'm also asking you to be good faith in the way you report them.
Understood. Have you thought, though, how the government might sort of respond in a policy way to those, those worst case scenarios around unemployment if they did unfold? Is that something you're thinking about now? Can you give them any indication?
Well, as I've said, in the forecast that I'm seeing, that is not likely to happen. If I saw forecasts with numbers that big, that would be a different story, and of course, in the first instance, there would be the automatic response of us ensuring that the welfare system was able to expand the amount of investment it was making to support people, and if there were other measures that were necessary, we would consider them.
Winston Peters last night said that New Zealand First won't do a deal with Labour. Does that nullify the point that you were making yesterday about there being a live risk of
I don't know. You've seen him through the years, haven't you? He'll always find a way of saying, "Oh, no, what I meant at the time was," or, "Well, that was just a tweet. You saw what I said." Look, this is someone... Well, I just think that it is difficult for me to forget that in 2017, the New Zealand First Party made a very deliberate choice to reject the then higher polling National Party and to form a government with them. I think it surprised a lot of New Zealanders when they picked Labour rather than National. And with that track record, I just think it's difficult to assume that they wouldn't find a circumstance in which they would choose to work with Labour.
Do you trust Winston Peters?
Yes.
Minister, what's the government's plan to get international...
I also know that he's got a great... because he's got a great... Jenna, because he's got a great way with words, and he'll find a way to say that that's what he was saying. Well, I trust him. But I also trust that he'll find a good way with words.
We have one more question and then the Minister.
Yeah.
Minister, what's the government's plan to get credit ratings back up, and what sort of timeline do you see on that?
Well, at the moment, our credit rating hasn't been changed. I think that's very important for you to understand. What they've said is you've got your AAA rating, you're one of 11 of the best countries in the world, but we're now watching you, which means that if things go downhill, we could take you down. So what does that mean for us? It means that we have to hold true to the fiscal objectives we have set for ourselves. It means that we do have to keep being disciplined about our spending, keep making savings, prioritise getting those books back in balance. If we don't do that, it is likely that being on watch turns into an actual downgrade. And that, I just want to highlight, that's not something that's just an esoteric economic argument. That really matters for New Zealanders, because that credit rating determines not only the price of the borrowing that the government does and the interest rates that we pay, it also affects the interest rates that anyone with a mortgage or a credit card pays. And so that means that your debt gets more and more expensive over time, and many New Zealanders will have had a period in their life or will know someone who's got themselves into a debt hole where they get out one credit card to pay off the other credit card, and then they get an emergency loan to pay off that credit card, and it can get really difficult very quickly. And countries in some sense are no different. You know, the UK went from having relatively low levels of debt to now debt running at about 100% of its economy pretty quickly. And so New Zealand has to pull the belt in now, or we risk really leaving future taxpayers with an enormous burden. And ultimately governments in that position are left with two choices. One, tax people a lot more, which I think would drive a lot of New Zealanders to live in other countries around the world, or cut the funding we provide to public services in a way that really affects frontline delivery for Kiwis, which again I think would affect their living standards dramatically. So we have to be sensible now to prevent a huge amount of pain later.
On Winston Peters, are you mischief-making, scaremongering and focused on personal petty reckon?
Didn't you love the way he giggled when he talked about mischief-making? I thought that said it all.
Thanks, everybody. We have a copy of the briefing as you go. That's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks.